Economics is a social science. What I mean by that is it takes human behavior and evaluates human behavior and develops laws out of that human behavior. So let's take the law of demand, for example. The law of demand states that as prices increase, the amount that consumers are going to buy or are willing to buy actually falls. So as prices increase, the quantity demanded will fall. Well, that makes sense, right? As prices go up, do you want to buy as much of that good? Let's say the price of gasoline goes up. Do you want to buy as many gallons of that gasoline? No, not necessarily. So therefore, as prices increase, the amount you buy actually falls. So what economics does is they look at all of these human patterns. If everybody acted rationally and everybody did not buy as much gasoline, then we could actually formulate a law saying that as prices increase, the amount we're going to consume falls. So we look at human behavior and we develop these laws surrounding it, such as the law of demand. Now, one thing to note is, do all humans act the same? Of course not. So whenever we develop these laws based on human behavior, and since not all humans act the same, these laws are not set in stone. Not like laws such as biology might create or physics might create. We all know the laws of physics. We have gravity. The law of gravity says that we are going to keep our feet planted on the ground unless there is some external motion or movement that causes us to come up off the ground, such as jumping. But we know for a fact we are going to stay on the ground and we're always going to come back to the earth. That is a law in physics. But in economics, the law of demand that we just got done talking about may not always hold true. Let's say, for example, people become scared that there's going to be a gasoline shortage. If that's the case, then that law of demand doesn't always hold true. Because if there's a gasoline shortage, people may be willing to buy more for that same amount of gas and actually pay more for it, buy a lot more, and pay higher prices for it at the same time, which isn't always that rational. So, economics, we try to develop these laws or create laws based on human behavior, but they don't always hold true. But what economics really rests on is the allocation of scarce resources. So a resource is anything that is more or less tangible, such as a desk, such as a chair, this expo marker, these whiteboards. Anything that you can typically touch or is tangible is considered a resource. Something like air is also a resource. Now here's something. All resources are relatively scarce, meaning that there is not an infinite amount of a particular resource. I just mentioned air. Here in Wyoming, we might consider air to be vastly abundant. Clean air is vastly abundant here in Wyoming and in a lot of places throughout the United States and throughout the world it is, meaning that it's really not all that scarce. But in some areas, air is still scarce. In places like China, where it has become so overpopulated and so polluted, clean air is a scarce resource. We can see that air is a resource here in the United States simply because the EPA charges people for polluting the air. So we now can see that air is a resource and it is a scarce resource. There is only so much air on this earth. And because all resources are relatively scarce, it actually causes us to develop the need for allocation. We must allocate those scarce resources. Let's look at water, for example. Who gets what water? There are water rights all throughout the whole world. Who gets that water? Well, that water is a scarce resource, and we have to allocate that water in some aspect. All resources must be allocated in some way, shape, or form. So, as we go through this, the definition for ag econ, we're going to talk about economics and specifically agricultural economics. Agricultural economics is the allocation of these scarce resources among those competing alternative uses found in the production, distribution, and consumption of food and fiber. Basically, this long definition means that agricultural economics looks at how are we going to allocate our scarce resources among all the different uses in the food and fiber industry, or in the agricultural commodities industry. Now, one other thing that we need to talk about is that economics rests on three main foundations. Those three foundations are scarcity, choice, and self-interest. We just got done talking about how all resources are relatively scarce. Well, because there is a relatively scarce resource, or there's a finite amount of resources on this earth and in this universe, for example, we must make choices on how are we going to allocate those resources. How are we going to use our resources? So because they're scarce, we must now make a decision of how we're going to use them. And what dictates our choices and how we actually use those scarce resources are based off of our self-interest. We're going to look at our self-interest, and we are going to make the choices based off of our self-interest that allocate those scarce resources.